Hello hockey fans and welcome back to another video. Roughly 4 months ago, I released a video detailing why the Chinese Olympic hockey team was an absolute mess. After all, whether it was their national roster being built from a basement-dwelling KHL team, their vastly inferior ranking by the IIHF, or the questionable eligibility of their many dual nationals, Team China was expected to be humiliated on the world stage by the juggernauts of the sport. Since I released that video in late November, and the Winter Olympics didn't take place until the following February, a lot of the points that I made were based on how China was expected to perform and how their team stacked up on paper compared to their opponents. Well, now that the tournament is firmly in the rearview mirror, and now that we have seen how each team performed at the event, it's only logical that we revisit the competition and see whether these predictions came true. Given that the hockey community expected them to fail miserably, and given that the Olympics ended roughly 6 weeks ago now, let's take a closer look at how China performed at the event in order to determine whether they lived up to expectations, they produced a respectable performance, or whether they proved all of their doubters wrong. So in today's video, join me as we ask the question, was the Chinese Olympic hockey team a mess? Let us begin with a quick recap of how China found themselves at the tournament, as well as why everyone expected them to be completely embarrassed on the international stage. Ranked 32nd in the world by the International Ice Hockey Federation, China was exempt from qualification to the men's hockey competition and were automatically awarded a place at the tournament since they were hosting the Winter Olympic Games in Beijing. Since they were ranked far lower than their upcoming opponents, and since they last competed on the international stage in the 4th tier of the World Championships back in 2019, a tournament in which they finished 5th place, in an attempt to even the playing field and give the hosts a fighting chance, China chose to build their roster with members of Kunlun Red Star, the only Chinese-based team in the KHL, and a roster filled with import players from North America and Europe, including brief NHLers Brandon Yip, Ryan Sproul and Spencer Fu, as well as netminder Jeremy Smith and Chris Chelios' son, Jake. However, while this decision would raise a number of questions surrounding whether foreign dual nationals should be allowed to represent the Chinese national team, as well as whether the country would be able to confirm each player's eligibility in time for the tournament, this strategy still wouldn't make them a legitimate force on the international stage, as many of these imports were mid-tier pro players at best, while Kunlun had been one of, if not the worst team in the entire KHL since joining the league back in 2016. After Kunlun lost a pair of exhibition games against Avangard Omsk and Amur Khabarovsk while icing the roster that China hoped to compete at the Olympics, and after IIHF officials determined that China would compete at the tournament following suggestions that they should be replaced by a stronger competitor, February 9th, 2022 finally rolled around and the men's hockey competition officially got underway. Since they had secured their place at the tournament via a technicality, and since their roster was vastly inferior to their opponents in every possible way, securing just a single point would have been regarded as an overwhelming victory for China, let alone actually winning a game. These expectations were further emphasised when it was revealed that China was placed in a group with Canada, America and Germany, all of whom were some of the top hockey nations in the world and had won many Olympic medals in years past. So, how did China perform during the tournament? Well, China's opening game of the competition and their first Olympic contest would see the hosts face Team USA at the Beijing National Indoor Stadium. Given that America were the 4th ranked nation in the world and had reached the quarter-final round during the prior 2018 Olympics in South Korea, China were in serious danger of being completely dominated by their vastly superior opponents. Unfortunately for the host nation and the 947 fans in attendance that day, this outcome would occur, as China were blown out by a score of 8-0. If that wasn't bad enough though, American forward Sean Farrell posted a hat-trick and 5 points, while China allowed 55 shots during the contest. 55 shots in 60 minutes? That's almost a shot against every minute of the game. Now, to China's credit, they did put up 29 shots of their own, and they only took 5 penalties during the entire game, which is actually pretty commendable given how outclassed they were, though they would allow 2 power play goals on those attempts, so things could have been better for them. Less than 24 hours after their opening game of the tournament, China would be back on the ice for their second contest against Germany, the 5th ranked nation at the time and the reigning silver medalists from the 2018 Olympics. Though Germany were unable to utilise their top talent since they were all playing in the NHL at the time, and though their hockey program isn't nearly as robust as their North American counterparts, that didn't mean that they were an easy opponent. That said, China seemed to utilise these circumstances to their advantage, as their game against the Germans would end up being their best performance of the tournament by far. Though they would allow a pair of first period goals and take a 3-0 deficit midway through the second, a late goal by Spencer Fu and a third period tally by Tyler Wang would cut Germany's lead to 1 and bring the score to 3-2. Though they tried everything they could to complete the comeback, the host nation were unable to tie the game, as German netminder Matthias Niederberger stopped every shot he faced for the final 11 minutes of play, and Germany held on to take the W. Despite suffering their second loss in as many games, the Chinese team should be commended for their effort during this contest. Sure, they still allowed 38 shots over the course of the game, and they were clearly the weaker side in every facet of the game, but they were able to put up 16 shots of their own, took just 3 penalties, and came a single goal away from potentially forcing overtime against the 5th ranked nation in the world. Sounds like a pretty valiant effort if you ask me, folks. China's third and final game of the group stage would be their toughest match yet, as they faced off against Canada, the number 1 ranked nation across the entire world at the time, and the reigning bronze medalists during the 2018 Olympics. Given how dominant of a hockey nation Canada has been since the sport's inception over a century ago, and given that their roster was filled with past and future stars of the NHL, the question wasn't if China would lose, but how badly they would be blown out. Though they would put up more of a fight than their opening game against America, Canada still faced little difficulty taking care of business, as China would end up falling by a score of 5-0. Despite being shut out for the second time in 3 games, China's performance against Canada was far from being their worst game at the tournament. In fact, it was somewhere in the middle between their previous 2 contests, as China allowed 44 shots on goal compared to the 26 that they made, took 5 penalties during the game, and allowed a lone power play goal. So I think it's fair to say that they could have done better, they could have done worse. Thanks to their loss to Canada, this meant that China would finish the group stage with an 0-3-0 record and a -14 goal differential, since they had allowed 16 goals during their first 3 games, while only scoring 2 of their own. Though they had posted the worst stats of any team in the competition, and though they had finished the group stage dead last in the standings, China would suit up for another game, since the tournament's format ensured that every nation made it past the group stage and advanced to the playoffs. And who would China face in the first round? Well, none other than the tournament's first seed, Team Canada. Well, here we go again, folks. As China entered their 4th game of the tournament and took to the ice for their rematch against Canada, it was pretty clear that the hosts were fighting an uphill battle. Once the final buzzer sounded and the contest was over, China's playoff run had ended just as quickly as it began, as they were defeated by Canada for the 2nd game in a row. Though they would allow more goals than their previous contest a few days prior, China would manage to add some scoring of their own this time around, as Corey Kane registered a pair of goals and break the shutout for just the 2nd time at the tournament, but a 2-goal game by Jordan Weal and a 5-point performance by Adam Tambellini would help Canada win the game by a score of 7-2. So just 6 days after the men's hockey competition had begun, China had finished their first trip to the tournament with an 0-4-0 record, a -19 goal difference, and a first round exit from the playoffs. Not exactly the greatest performance in Olympic hockey history, but given that most people expected them to be blown out of every single game, and given that most hockey fans predicted that they would crash and burn, the Chinese team actually produced a rather commendable performance. After all, they produced a close game against Germany and registered similar stats to the previous host South Korea when they took part in 2018. Things could have gone far, far worse. So, was the Chinese Olympic hockey team a mess? Well, it's pretty clear that the on-ice product left a lot to be desired, and it's obvious that the team didn't earn their place on merit alone, but China's participation in the event could lead to an increased interest in the sport in a country that has yet to find its footing in the hockey world, so it's tough to say whether it was a complete mess overall. Sure, China's performance was nothing short of a disaster on paper, and it's highly unlikely that they'll return to the tournament anytime soon, but we shouldn't minimise the potential impact that China's appearance could have on their country's hockey programme moving forwards. After all, China has a population of nearly 1.5 billion. Think of just how many people were watching a hockey game for the first time during these Olympics. How many of them only tuned in because China were playing, and how many of them enjoyed it so much that they decide to become fans of the sport moving forwards. While this increased interest is primarily due to circumstance, and while it could easily fizzle out over the coming months once the games are a distant memory and people move on to different things, if even a fraction of these viewers decide to follow the sport more closely, the game could experience exponential growth in a relatively untapped hockey market, and could lead to the Chinese hockey program taking great strides forward over the coming years. Yes, they iced a roster filled with import players, and yes, they lost every single game that they played, but seeing your country compete at the Winter Olympics against some of the best hockey players in the world could go a long way to inspiring the next generation of Chinese hockey players and fans. And who knows, maybe a handful of these viewers might decide to learn how to play the game, commit hundreds of hours to honing their talent, and maybe even turn pro one day. None of this is guaranteed, but it's certainly possible. While China's Olympic participation won't make them a juggernaut of the game anytime soon, and while their hockey program is likely to experience minor yet gradual improvements over the coming years, if they are able to play this right, China could continue to increase the interest and exposure of the sport across the country and potentially usher in a new generation of Chinese hockey fans. Sure, China isn't the most well-respected nation in the world for good reason, and their leadership have made a myriad of questionable decisions, but if the people themselves gain a new love for the sport and begin to follow the game more closely, then they should be welcomed into the community with open arms. After all, who doesn't want more hockey fans? I know I do. Whether this momentum results in any real progress or whether it quickly dries up remains to be seen. But given that the team received a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to compete on the international stage, and they were given a brief moment in the spotlight despite having no business being there, regardless of how well they played or where they finished in the standings, I'm sure it didn't seem like a mess to them or their new fans. And that was a look at whether the Chinese Olympic hockey team was an absolute mess. What do you guys think about China's performance at the tournament, or the effect it could have on the country's hockey program moving forwards? Do you think that they produced a valiant effort, all things considered, or was it a complete disaster? Let me know in the comments below, I would love to hear what you guys think. But thank you very much for watching, guys, I hope you have enjoyed. Please feel free to like, subscribe, share, or watch some of my other videos. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye! A big thank you to Clayton Hallam, Drew Fawcett, Houston NG, Raquel Henriques, and Worthless Pieces for helping support this video via Patreon. If you too want to help support the channel a little bit further and get a shout out at the end of every future video, make sure you head over to patreon.com/oddmanrush and become a patron today.